Okay, let's dive into this explainer. Most of us don't even think twice about the standard 8-hour workday, right? It's just a regular part of modern life. But the truth is, the boundaries of our workday weren't just politely handed down by generous factory owners. No way. They were forged in the streets of Chicago, born out of intense struggle, radical ideology, and a tragedy that literally shook the world. Today, we're taking an objective look at the explosive origins of the modern workday known as the Haymarket Affair. It really is one of the most dramatic arcs in American history. We're going to explore exactly how a simple, universal demand for shorter hours escalated into a deadly bombing, a deeply controversial trial that executed men for their ideas rather than their actions, and how the massive fallout from these events left a legacy that permanently shaped the labor rights you and I rely on today.
Now, to understand the breaking point, we really have to understand the absolute pressure cooker that was industrial Chicago in the 1880s. Picture the grueling reality of workers trimming meat in these massive factories. Roughly 2/3 of Chicago's factory workers were immigrants. But here's the truly insidious part. Factory managers intentionally created different wage scales and designated specific jobs for different ethnic immigrant groups, like the unskilled Irish, German, and Polish workers. It was a calculated management strategy specifically designed to divide the workers and discourage them from ever organizing into unified unions. But sheer exhaustion eventually pushed them together anyway.
Which brings us to Section 1, the demand for 8 hours. The demand for an 8-hour workday had actually started way back in the 1860s, but by the 1880s, the issue fiercely resurfaced. As the movement grew, it attracted a wide range of organizers, including immigrants who brought socialist and anarchist ideals with them. And among these organizers were a truly fascinating couple, Albert and Lucy Parsons. The sheer irony of their personal background is incredible. Albert was a former Confederate soldier from Texas who became a radical Republican. Lucy claimed her parents were Mexican and Native American, though later research suggests she was actually likely a former slave. Forced to flee Texas in 1873 because of laws against their mixed-race marriage, they settled in Chicago. By 1883, their struggles and political evolution led them to help found the International Working People's Association. This was an anarchist-influenced labor organization demanding a stateless society and strict equality for people of color and women.
Let's move to and see how this builds in Section 2, Escalation in Chicago.
In the spring of 1886, the Federation of Organized Trades urged workers to officially observe an 8-hour day and go on strike. The timeline accelerates rapidly right here. On May 1st, unionists, reformers, anarchists, and everyday workers joined forces. 35,000 workers walked off the job initially, with tens of thousands more joining over the next few days. We're talking up to 80,000 strikers in Chicago alone. But on May 3rd, the tension snapped. At the McCormick Reaper plant, police fired on striking workers, killing 2 of them. The city instantly transformed into a powder keg. In response, organizers called for a mass protest meeting the very next evening, May 4th, at Haymarket Square.
The rhetoric flying around the city was, frankly, explosive. Listen to this primary source quote from a piece titled Blood, written by anarchist August Spies on May 4th. He wrote, "Lead and powder as a cure for dissatisfied workmen. Thus are the 8-hour men to be intimidated. This is law and order." Hearing this really shows us the highly charged, radical fury that was circulating through the activist press in response to the police killings.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this infamous revenge circular that was distributed to working men across the city. Printed in both English and German, it urged workers to arm themselves and appear in full force. It's a stark reminder of how organizers appealed directly to the workers' fresh grief and rage to draw them to the Haymarket meeting.
Which brings us to our climax. Section 3, the Haymarket bombing.
Despite those fiery circulars, the gathering itself actually began quite peacefully. Bilingual flyers called the masses to the meeting, which makes total sense because the lively multilingual press was an absolute staple of the immigrant-heavy socialist and anarchist movements in Chicago. As the evening wore on at Haymarket, a spot named for a market building that ironically wasn't even there anymore, speakers addressed the crowd. Rain began to fall, and the crowd actually started to dwindle.
But then, an inspector named John Bonfield led police into the meeting, ordering the remaining crowd to disperse. What happened next changed history. From out of the darkness, an unidentified person threw a bomb. It exploded, instantly killing 1 police officer. The police immediately drew their weapons and fired into the crowd, setting off a chaotic and deadly riot right there in the streets of Chicago. And here is the craziest part. To this very day, the identity of the person who threw the bomb remains entirely unknown.
The toll of that night was devastating. Ultimately, 8 police officers died. Over 60 officers were injured, and an undetermined number of civilians in the crowd were killed or wounded in the gunfire and chaos. The immediate reaction from the city was swift and severe. The mayor banned all meetings and processions, shut down the radical press operations, and sweeping arrests were made all across Chicago.
This brings us to Section 4, the controversial trial.
The fallout from the bombing led straight into what is widely considered one of the worst miscarriages of justice in United States history. Let's look at the facts of the trial. The state brought a massive 69-count indictment against 8 radical organizers, including Albert Parsons and August Spies. The trial was presided over by Judge Joseph Gary, who was notoriously biased, and jury selection seated men who openly acknowledged they were already prejudiced against the defendants. But here is the most glaring fact of all. The state presented absolutely zero concrete evidence linking any of the 8 arrested men to the actual throwing of the bomb. They were tried and convicted based entirely on their radical anarchist ideologies and their public writings, not for the physical act of the bombing. They were literally condemned for their ideas, not their actions. The verdicts were incredibly harsh. 7 of the men were sentenced to death. Despite numerous appeals reaching the Illinois Supreme Court, 4 men, Albert Parsons, August Spies, George Engel, and Adolph Fisher, were executed by hanging on November 11, 1887. Louis Ling committed suicide in his cell the day before. So the crucial point is what happened next. Less than 10 years later, in 1893, Governor Peter Altgeld granted the 3 surviving, imprisoned men an absolute pardon. His explicit reasoning, the complete lack of evidence, and the undeniable reality that they had not received a fair trial.
Let's move on to our final chapter, Section 5, the legacy of Lucy Parsons.
With Albert executed, you might think the story of the Parsons ends right there. But actually, the fight was taken up with incredible ferocity by his widow, Lucy Parsons. She is a towering figure in labor history. She didn't just mourn, she organized. She took the lead in the Haymarket defense and traveled the country fundraising for their appeals. Over a 50-year career, she utilized radical, direct action to fight for the marginalized. In 1892, she published a paper called Freedom to attack lynchings and racism against African Americans. In 1905, she was the second woman to join the founding of the Industrial Workers of the World Union. She led massive hunger demonstrations in Chicago in 1915. And in 1927, she worked with the communist-led International Labor Defense to advocate for unjustly accused African Americans and labor activists. She continued her activism relentlessly until her death in a fire in 1942. Through the tireless efforts of organizers like Lucy Parsons and countless others over the decades, labor unions slowly, painstakingly made progress. But it took time. It wasn't until 1938, over 50 years after the Haymarket bombing, that the New Deal's Fair Labor Standards Act was passed, finally making the 8-hour workday the law of the land in the United States.
And this brilliantly illustrates why understanding our history is so absolutely vital. We take our weekends and our 8-hour shifts for granted, but they were paid for with strikes, rigged trials, and decades of relentless activism. So next time you clock out after a standard shift and head home to enjoy your evening, ask yourself, how much of our everyday modern comfort was built on the tragedies, the radical ideas, and the tireless fights of the past? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.